Shadowport Station existed in the spaces between legitimate civilization and outright chaos, a place where questions weren't asked and credits talked louder than laws. Captain Jake Sullivan had visited dozens of similar stations during his years running cargo through the galaxy's more dangerous sectors, but Shadowport had a reputation that made even hardened smugglers nervous. He hadn't planned to stop here. His ship, the aging but reliable Star Runner, had suffered a catastrophic fusion coupling failure 3 systems out from his intended destination, leaving him with barely enough power to limp to the nearest port. Shadowport happened to be that port, and Jake happened to be desperate enough to risk docking at a station controlled by pirates, mercenaries, and worse. The repairs would take at least 48 hours, assuming he could find a mechanic willing to work on human technology and parts that weren't completely rusted through. That meant 2 days on a station where survival often depended on maintaining the right balance between confidence and invisibility. Jake had managed the invisibility part for most of his first day, keeping to the quieter maintenance sectors and avoiding the central entertainment district where most of the station's dangers congregated. But hunger and the need for information about repair services had finally driven him to the nebula's edge, the largest cantina in the station's commercial zone. The establishment was exactly what he'd expected, dimly lit, filled with smoke from a dozen different worlds, and populated by beings who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime syndicate's recruitment poster. Jake found a small table in a corner, ordered something that might have been food, and tried to blend into the background while listening for useful conversations about ship repairs. That's when he saw her. She sat at a raised table that commanded a view of the entire cantina, surrounded by a crew that looked like they could conquer small planets before breakfast. But it wasn't the dangerous-looking aliens flanking her that caught Jake's attention, it was the woman herself. She was Zephyrian, he realized, recognizing the elegant bone structure and naturally luminous skin that marked her species as one of the galaxy's most ancient civilizations. But where most Zephyrians he'd encountered had been scholars or diplomats, this woman radiated deadly grace that made the air around her seem to shimmer with threat. Her hair was midnight black, pulled back in intricate braids that revealed pointed ears adorned with what appeared to be weapons disguised as jewelry. Her clothing was practical but expensive, clearly tailored for someone who expected to fight at any moment but wanted to look magnificent while doing it. Scars marked her visible skin. Not disfiguring, but telling stories of battles survived and enemies defeated. But it was her eyes that held Jake transfixed. Even across the crowded cantina, he could see they were the deep crimson of fresh blood, burning with an intelligence and fury that seemed to weigh the souls of everyone in the room. Jake realized he'd been staring for far too long when those terrible, beautiful eyes suddenly focused on him with laser-like intensity. The cantina's ambient noise seemed to die away as conversations faltered and heads turned to see what had captured the attention of the notorious Vexaria Nightblade. Because that's who she was, Jake realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach. The pirate queen whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by stories of her devastating beauty and quick temper. Ships that encountered her fleet had 2 choices, surrender immediately or face destruction so complete that not even debris remained to tell the tale. Vexaria's glare was legendary. Hardened criminals had reportedly fled star systems just to avoid the possibility of meeting those burning eyes. Her stare was said to strip away pretense and leave victims feeling as though she could see every failure, every weakness, every shameful thought they'd ever harbored. Jake felt the weight of that gaze now, pressing against him like a physical force. Around him, the cantina held its collective breath, waiting to see how the foolish human would die for his presumption in looking directly at the feared pirate queen. But instead of looking away, instead of cowering or stammering apologies, Jake found himself studying her face more carefully. Beneath the intimidation and the barely controlled violence, he saw something else, a kind of profound loneliness that resonated with his own solitary existence among the stars. Vexaria rose from her table with fluid grace, her hand resting casually on the grip of a weapon that probably cost more than Jake's entire ship. Her crew remained seated, but their positions subtly shifted to better positions for violence. The cantina's other patrons began edging toward exits, recognizing the signs of impending bloodshed. She approached Jake's table like a predator stalking prey, each step calculated and precise. When she reached him, she leaned forward, placing both hands on the table's surface and bringing her face close enough that he could smell the exotic perfume that couldn't quite mask the scent of danger that clung to her. "You dare look at me?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made grown warriors reconsider their life choices. The smart response would have been to apologize, to grovel, to plead for mercy and hope that her reputation for occasional clemency might save his life. The safe response would have been to look away and hope she found his submission sufficiently entertaining to let him live. Instead, Jake met her burning gaze steadily and spoke the simple truth that had been growing in his mind since he'd first seen her. "Only because you're beautiful." The words hung in the air between them like a fragile bridge across an impossible chasm. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden absolute silence that filled the cantina. Vexaria's expression flickered through a range of emotions too quick to identify: surprise, confusion, something that might have been pain. For a moment that felt like eternity, nobody moved. Then Vexaria slowly straightened, her hand falling away from her weapon as she continued to stare at the human who had just called the galaxy's most feared pirate queen beautiful. The silence stretched until Jake began to wonder if his words had somehow broken something fundamental in the universe. Vexaria continued to stare at him, her crimson eyes searching his face as if trying to decode an alien language. Around them, the cantina's patrons remained frozen, apparently afraid that even breathing might trigger the explosion of violence they all expected. Finally, Vexaria moved. But instead of drawing her weapon or signaling her crew to attack, she pulled out the chair across from Jake and sat down with the same fluid grace that had marked her approach. "Beautiful," she repeated, the words sounding strange in her voice, as if she were testing an unfamiliar concept. "That's not a word usually associated with me." Jake risked a small smile. "Then people haven't been paying attention." "People pay very close attention to me," she replied, though her tone had lost some of its menace. "They pay attention to my weapons, my ships, my crew's body count. They pay attention to the bounties on their heads and the likelihood of surviving an encounter with the Nightblade. But not to you," Jake observed. "Not to the person behind all of that." Vexaria's expression hardened slightly. "There is no person behind it. I am the Nightblade. I am fear and death and the sound of hull breaches in the void. That's all there is." "I don't believe that," Jake said quietly. "You don't know me, human." "No," he agreed, "but I know what it's like to be defined by what others think you are instead of who you actually are." Something flickered in those burning eyes. "And what do others think you are, cargo pilot?" Jake gestured to himself with self-deprecating humor. "Small-time operator, probably running contraband, definitely not important enough to notice. Someone who takes the dangerous routes because he can't afford the safe ones." "And who are you actually?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. "Someone trying to make a difference in a galaxy that doesn't seem to care much about people like me." Vexaria was quiet for a moment, studying his face with an intensity that was somehow different from her earlier intimidating stare. "You're not afraid of me." "Should I be?" "Everyone else is." "Everyone else hasn't had a conversation with you," Jake pointed out. "They're afraid of the stories they've heard." "The stories are true," she said, though there was something almost defensive in her tone. "Some of them, maybe. But stories have a way of growing in the telling. And they rarely include the whole truth." Vexaria's crew was watching the exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Jake could see them exchanging glances, clearly uncertain about how to respond to their feared leader having what appeared to be a normal conversation with a stranger. "What makes you think there's more to the truth?" Vexaria asked. "Because I've seen your eyes," Jake replied honestly. "And there's pain there that doesn't match the stories about a heartless killer." For the first time since she'd sat down, Vexaria's composure cracked. She looked away, her fingers absently tracing one of the scars on her forearm. "Pain can make monsters of us all. Or it can make us stronger." "Stronger," she repeated with bitter amusement. "Is that what you call this?" She gestured to herself, to the weapons, to the crew that watched them with hands near their own armaments. I call it survival, Jake said. And I call it impressive that you've not only survived whatever made those scars, but built something powerful enough that the mention of your name makes people reconsider their life choices. You have an interesting perspective for a cargo pilot. I've had time to develop interesting perspectives. Space is very quiet when you're flying alone. Before Vexaria could respond, Jake's attention was caught by movement at the cantina's entrance. 3 figures in corporate security uniforms had entered, their stance and equipment marking them as professionals rather than the usual collection of misfits that populated Shadowport. Expecting company? Vexaria asked, following his gaze. Not the kind I want, Jake muttered, recognizing the insignia on their uniforms. Helix Corporation, the same megacorp that had been hunting him across 3 sectors for the past 2 months. The security team's leader was scanning the cantina systematically, and Jake knew it was only a matter of seconds before he was spotted. His hand moved instinctively toward the sidearm he wore, though he knew it wouldn't be much use against professional bounty hunters in a confined space. Friends of yours? Vexaria asked, her tone casual but her posture subtly shifting into readiness. Opposite of friends, Jake replied. They think I stole something from them. Did you? Technically, yes. Morally, no. Vexaria's smile was sharp and predatory. My favorite kind of theft. The lead bounty hunter's gaze found Jake, and his expression shifted into professional satisfaction. He began moving through the crowd, his companions flanking him in a practiced formation. Jake Sullivan, the man called out, his voice carrying over the cantina's ambient noise. Helix Corporation has a warrant for your arrest. Come quietly, and we might not have to make this messy. Jake started to rise, calculating his chances of reaching the cantina's rear exit before they could draw their weapons. But Vexaria's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Sit, she said quietly. Then, louder, addressing the bounty hunters, I'm afraid Mr. Sullivan is currently under my protection. The lead hunter stopped dead, recognition dawning on his face as he realized who had spoken. The color drained from his features as he identified the notorious pirate queen sitting calmly at a corner table. Lady Nightblade, he stammered. We had no idea, we're just here on corporate business. I'm sure you are, Vexaria replied pleasantly. But Mr. Sullivan is my guest, and I take hospitality very seriously. I'm sure Helix Corporation wouldn't want to violate Shadowport's neutrality agreements over something as trivial as corporate theft. The bounty hunter looked between Jake and Vexaria, clearly calculating the odds of surviving a confrontation with the pirate queen versus returning to his employers empty-handed. The calculation apparently didn't favor violence, because he took a careful step backward. Of course, Lady Nightblade. We'll report that the target was beyond our operational parameters. As the bounty hunters retreated, Jake stared at Vexaria in amazement. Why did you do that? She was quiet for a moment, her fingers still wrapped around his wrist. You called me beautiful, she said finally. It's been a very long time since anyone saw anything in me worth protecting. And now? Now I'm curious to see what else you might see. Over the next 2 days, while Jake waited for his ship's repairs, he found himself drawn into an unlikely friendship with the galaxy's most feared pirate. Vexaria seemed as surprised by her interest in him as her crew was, but she continued to seek out his company, finding excuses to visit the docking bay where the Star Runner was berthed or inviting him to join her for meals in the cantina. Your crew thinks I'm a bad influence, Jake observed, noting the worried glances from her lieutenant, a scarred Corvin who looked like he could bench press a shuttlecraft. Thane thinks everyone is a bad influence, Vexaria replied, sharing a meal that was surprisingly good despite the station's reputation. He's been trying to protect me from myself for the better part of a decade. How long have you been the Nightblade? Jake asked. Vexaria was quiet for a moment, her crimson eyes growing distant. 15 years. Before that, I was someone else entirely. Want to tell me about her? She was naive, Vexaria said finally. She believed in things like justice and honor and the basic decency of civilized beings. She thought that noble blood and good intentions were enough to protect the people she cared about. What happened to her? She learned that the universe doesn't care about noble intentions. Vexaria's fingers traced the largest scar on her neck, a mark that looked like it had come from a blade meant to kill. Her family's shipping enterprise was destroyed by corporate manipulation and sabotage. Her parents died in what was made to look like an accident. Her younger brother disappeared into a corporate detention facility and was never seen again. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. Helix Corporation. Vexaria's gaze snapped to his, suddenly sharp with interest. How did you know that? Because they're the ones who've been hunting me. And because I used to work for them, before I learned what they really were. You worked for Helix? There was danger in her voice now, the predator reasserting itself. For 3 years, Jake admitted. I thought I was helping to expand trade networks and bring prosperity to frontier colonies. I didn't realize I was helping them identify resources to exploit and populations to displace. And when you did realize? I tried to work within the system to change things. When that failed, I started redirecting supply shipments to colonies that were being deliberately starved out. Eventually, they caught on. Vexaria studied him with new intensity. The cargo they think you stole, medical supplies for the Kepler colonies? Among other things. Helix was planning to let them die from a plague that could be easily treated, then move in to claim the mineral rights from the abandoned worlds. I couldn't let that happen. So you became a criminal to save people you'd never met. I became someone I could live with, Jake corrected. Vexaria was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about him. The naive girl I used to be would have admired that. What does the woman you are now think? She thinks you're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, Jake admitted. Their conversation was interrupted by Thane approaching their table with the kind of urgent stride that suggested trouble. He leaned down to whisper something in Vexaria's ear, and Jake saw her expression harden into the mask of the Nightblade. What is it? Jake asked. Helix didn't give up as easily as we thought, she replied grimly. They've hired the Crimson Fong mercenary company to extract you. 3 ships, full military loadout. Jake felt his heart sink. The Crimson Fong were professionals who wouldn't be intimidated by reputation or neutrality agreements. How long do we have? They're already docking, Thane reported. Station security is trying to maintain neutrality, but the mercs are claiming salvage rights on your ship. Salvage rights are legal cover for theft, Jake said bitterly. Helix uses them to seize assets all across the frontier. Vexaria stood, her hand moving to her weapons with practiced ease. Not on my station. It's not your station, Jake pointed out. And this isn't your fight. She turned to look at him, her crimson eyes burning with something between anger and determination. You called me beautiful, Jake Sullivan. You saw something in me that I thought was dead and buried. That makes it my fight. This could start a war with Helix, he warned. Good, she replied with a predatory smile. I've been looking for an excuse to hurt them for 15 years. The docking bay was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Jake could see the Star Runner surrounded by Crimson Fong mercenaries, their leader arguing with the station's harbor master about impound procedures. But what really caught his attention was the sight of Vexaria's crew taking positions throughout the bay, their weapons concealed but ready. You brought your entire team? Jake asked. I brought my family, Vexaria corrected. And family protects family. The Crimson Fong leader, a heavily augmented human with more cybernetics than original biology, spotted their approach and signaled his team. Lady Nightblade. I hope you're not here to interfere with legitimate corporate business. I'm here to prevent theft, she replied calmly. That ship belongs to Mr. Sullivan, and he's under my protection. Helix Corporation has legal claim to all assets belonging to Jake Sullivan, the mercenary leader stated. That includes his ship, his cargo, and his person. Helix Corporation has no legal standing on Shadowport Station, Vexaria countered. And their puppet mercenaries have no authority here. The tension in the docking bay ratcheted up several notches as both sides prepared for violence. Jake could see station security taking cover, unwilling to intervene in a conflict between such dangerous parties. This is going to get people killed, he said quietly to Vexaria. Probably, she agreed. Does that change your mind about fighting back? Jake thought about the colonies he tried to save, the people who had died because of corporate greed, the years he'd spent running from enemies who would never stop hunting him. No. But I don't want you to fight my battles for me. Vexaria's smile was fierce and beautiful and terrible. Then fight them with me. As Jake drew his sidearm, standing shoulder to shoulder with the notorious Pirate Queen, he realized that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought for glory or profit, but for the simple right to choose who you wanted to be. The first shots echoed through the docking bay like thunder, and Jake discovered that Vexaria Nightblade was even more magnificent in combat than she was in conversation. The battle in the docking bay was brief but decisive. Vexaria's crew moved with the precision of people who had fought together for years, while the Crimson Fong mercenaries found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned by opponents who knew every angle and blind spot of their home territory. Jake discovered that his years of evading corporate security had given him skills he hadn't known he possessed, and fighting alongside someone who actually wanted him alive was a revelation. When the smoke cleared, 3 Crimson Fong operatives were dead, 2 were unconscious, and their leader was on his knees with Vexaria's blade at his throat. The remaining mercenaries had surrendered, apparently deciding that their contract wasn't worth dying for. Send a message to Helix, Vexaria told the captured leader, her voice carrying the kind of cold authority that made smart people reconsider their life choices. Tell them that Jake Sullivan is under the protection of the Nightblade fleet. Any further attempts to harm him will be considered acts of war against my territory. You can't protect him forever, the mercenary gasped. Helix has resources you can't imagine. I have imagination enough, she replied. And I have something Helix doesn't, people who fight for each other instead of for profit margins. As station security finally arrived to clean up the mess, Jake found himself standing with Vexaria in the aftermath of the most significant battle of his life. The Star Runner was undamaged, his freedom was secure, and he was alive, all because a woman who was supposed to be the galaxy's most feared pirate had chosen to protect him. Why? He asked as they watched the prisoners being led away. You barely know me. This could have cost you everything. Vexaria was quiet for a moment, her crimson eyes reflecting the docking bay's lights. Do you know what it's like to be seen only as a weapon? To have people fear you so much that they forget you're a person? I'm starting to understand, Jake replied honestly. For 15 years, I've been the Nightblade. I've been death and fury and everything terrible that people whisper about in the dark corners of space. And I told myself that was enough, that being feared was better than being vulnerable. But you looked at me and saw beauty instead of threat. You talked to me like I was someone worth knowing rather than someone to be avoided. You reminded me that I used to be more than just a weapon. Jake reached out tentatively, taking her scarred hand in his. You still are more than that. You always were. The woman I used to be died the day Helix destroyed my family, she said softly. But maybe someone new could live. Someone who's learned from the Nightblade's strength but isn't defined by her anger. Someone who could be both beautiful and dangerous, Jake suggested. Someone who could choose to be beautiful because she's strong enough to be dangerous when necessary, Vexaria agreed. Over the next few hours, as the immediate crisis settled into routine station business, Jake found himself thinking about futures he'd never dared to imagine. His conversation with Vexaria had revealed that they shared more than just enemies, they shared a desire to make the galaxy a better place for people who couldn't protect themselves. My ship is repaired, he told her as they shared what had become their customary evening meal. I could leave whenever I want. But you're not going to, she observed. I don't want to, he admitted. But I also don't want to assume anything about what you want. Vexaria was quiet for a moment, studying his face with the same intensity she'd shown during their first encounter. What I want, she said finally, is to find out what we could build together. The Nightblade fleet has resources, connections, and the kind of reputation that makes corporate executives nervous. You have knowledge of their operations, contacts among the people they're trying to hurt, and a moral compass that points toward justice rather than profit. You're talking about war against Helix, Jake realized. I'm talking about protecting the people they want to destroy, she corrected. If that means war, so be it. And us? What happens to whatever this is between us? Vexaria's smile was radiant in a way that transformed her entire face. I think we find out if beautiful and dangerous can learn to be beautiful and happy. I'd like that, Jake said honestly. Then stay, she replied simply. Be my partner in all of this. Help me remember how to be someone worth protecting instead of someone to fear. And help you stay someone worth fighting beside, Jake added. Exactly. The next morning, Jake transferred his personal belongings from the Star Runner to Vexaria's flagship, a magnificent vessel called Crimson Dawn that somehow managed to be both elegant and predatory. His cargo ship would remain docked at Shadowport, maintained by Vexaria's people and ready for missions that required subtlety rather than overwhelming force. Any regrets? Vexaria asked as they stood on the command deck, watching Shadowport Station fall away in the viewports. Only that it took me so long to meet someone brave enough to be beautiful in a galaxy that rewards ugliness, Jake replied. And I regret that it took so long to meet someone who could see beauty where everyone else saw only threat. As the Crimson Dawn jumped to hyperspace, carrying them toward their first joint mission, evacuating a colony world before Helix could implement their latest atrocity, Jake marveled at how completely his life had changed. He'd entered the cantina as a fugitive with no future beyond running and hiding. Now he was partner to the most powerful pirate queen in known space, and together they were going to make the corporations that preyed on the innocent learn to fear something more than their quarterly profit reports. You know, he said to Vexaria as she coordinated with her navigation team, when you asked me why I dared to look at you, I gave you the simple answer. Oh. She turned to face him, eyebrows raised in curiosity. The complete answer is that I looked because you're beautiful, but I kept looking because you're magnificent. There's a difference. What kind of difference? Beautiful is what you see in a moment, Jake explained. Magnificent is what you discover when you take the time to really know someone. Beautiful caught my attention. Magnificent made me want to stay. Vexaria's smile was radiant enough to power the ship's engines. In that case, Jake Sullivan, I suppose we should find out just how magnificent we can become together. As their ship carried them toward adventures that would reshape the balance of power in their corner of the galaxy, Jake reflected that sometimes the most important battles weren't won with weapons or tactics, but with the courage to see past surface impressions and recognize the possibilities that existed in every person worth fighting for. And sometimes, the most beautiful thing about someone was their willingness to become more than the universe expected them to be.